So hi everybody, my name is Lynn Pausic. I'm with a company called Expero, and we do a lot of work in AI and technology that utilizes AI. And based on those learnings, what we want to talk about today is how to best use your humans in the loop to improve your machine learning. And this is me. I get very excited talking about anything that has to do with data or intelligent analytics. And I get the joy of delivering analytics based on AI every day to my customers. Really to get the biggest value out of whatever kind of artificial intelligence you're applying. So that could be machine learning, it could be NLP, sentiment analysis, computer visioning, all those wonderful things. At the end of the day, things work better. We get better results when humans and machines work well together. Fundamental challenge with this is, unlike machines, human beings, we have limited capacity. So this means we need to choose very wisely where and how we're going to apply humans to the process. So today we're going to look at kind of 5 key areas where bringing humans into the loop to impact the work that's being done on AI, sometimes autonomously, sometimes manually, can have tremendous results. So we're going to look at data. We're going to look at the tech ecosystem, visibility and traceability, ethics and bias in the system, and then overall how the system is used. So we're going to jump into the first topic here, which is data. So many of you have probably heard this old adage, garbage in, garbage out, right? So AI ecosystems, it's interesting because from a data standpoint, they're ingesting tons of data, but they're also delivering new data as a product, right? So after you run your models and you come up with these wonderful findings, outcomes, that sometimes serves as the input to the next run of your model, right? So round and round we go in this cycle. So we may start off with clean data, but on the way to evolving the learning, we may end up with more muddiness in our data. And then compounding the problem, often time spent on things like data hygiene can be perceived as time lost rather than spending time perfecting the model or perfecting our ops or our delivery. But it doesn't matter, even if we started with clean data, if we end up fueling it with lackluster data in between, we're still not going to get the results we're looking for. So one of the things that we talk a lot about that we found is valuable is focusing on data hygiene. And there's a number of things to touch on with that. First thing, if you're not already versioning your data, that is the data that the models are using, the outcomes, the new data that comes in that could be from a combination of outcomes and other sources, get on that pronto. Even the most rudimentary versioning can go a long way. So start simply with timestamps. You could advance to using open source tools like DBC with Git, things of that nature. You could advance then to more sophisticated systems like Pachyderm or something that's really going to get in there and enable you to track the changes and the results and the metadata that ties it all together. But super important that you get on that. No effort is too small, and it can really help the garbage in, garbage out factor. And also doing periodic QC checks can be a great way to utilize your humans of just understanding, taking a look under the covers of what's going on with the data provenance and the lineage, even if you're doing that in a simple timestamp sort of way. The next thing I want to touch on here is the tech ecosystem overall. So if you're coming at this from a data science standpoint, sometimes we think maybe a little myopically of like your notebook is your tech ecosystem. If you are pushing data science outcomes to a broader audience, then you need to figure out how you're playing in that broader ecosystem of productization, right? So you need to be contemplating things around CI/CD, so software engineering, software engineering processes. So how do we make our models, our training, the data, the hygiene that we just talked about, how does that all fit into the CI/CD rhythm of pushing out outcomes to users? The monitoring, being able to get in there and monitor what data is coming in, monitoring the outcomes of those models. So the key takeaway here is when you're thinking about the tech ecosystem, it's not just about the algorithms that you're contributing from a data science vantage point, right? And there are a number of things where humans play a vital role besides helping to generate and perfect those algorithms. So we go so far as to advise many of our clients before you get into the building of those algorithms, you want to really understand how you're going to monitor and validate the capabilities that you're building, right? Without those tools in place, how are you going to know if you're on the right track? Further, if you're going to be productionizing, I mentioned on the diagram a minute ago, thinking about continuous integration, continuous development, and how you're going to fit into that. If you're not already using some sort of tool or have maybe built some proprietary pipeline tools of your own, you really need to think about the AI operations aspect, right? So how we're going to automate the models, the training, how we're going to be able to check in on that. These are all great tasks for human beings to be working on prior to, or at least in parallel with any algorithms that you're laying down. And then finally, this last bullet here is a little bit of a more advanced concept. But when you start to get into it, you're probably going to need a more sophisticated way of storing information, data generated that has to do with understanding the original set of data, so getting into your provenance and the way that it went in versus the way that it's currently recording today. So often what we do there is set up more of a bitemporal kind of a storage situation, so we can store different versions in time of the information and marry that back into our provenance. That one's a little bit more sophisticated, but at least those monitoring and validation metrics in place. The third thing is visibility and traceability. So it kind of goes hand in hand with some of what we were talking about there with the tech ecosystem. But if we can't see how the algorithms are working once we do have them, and we can't see the maturity, the training, the things that have happened with our models, how do we know if the system is working, right? So this is an example here of a snapshot of one of our tools that we utilize for model interpretability. A great way to involve humans in this part of the ecosystem is to give people that are not just data scientist tools, but this particular tool is actually aimed at SME users. So it's somewhere between a tool that a data scientist might use to understand if their model is working, and someone who is a subject matter expert or a product manager could look at this and start to understand, okay, am I headed in the right direction? Do I have some big ticket bias problems? And so you could see that we have some things in here that are a little more statistical in nature and some other things that are a little more KPI in nature. So I could start to look at, for example, do I need to keep my pulse on a potential gender bias issue, right? What is going on with my model? So the point here is that it's often we don't even have the tools necessarily that we need in place to really track what's happening sometimes with our models and with our system. And when we do, they're often aimed more at data scientists. Using other humans besides data scientists in the loop when it comes to model training can be super helpful. Our SME users or just SMEs of subject area, they will often have a very good gut check of whether something seems like it's headed in the right direction, and put all the data science nuance and detail aside, you can bring these types of humans into the loop to walk through kind of the trends that you're seeing with your models, and are we going in the right direction, right? So for example, great triggers for involving these folks. One, if the data science team is getting an outcome they didn't expect, then the SME probably is also would see an outcome they didn't expect. But they'll have a more of a finely tuned spider sense for where things maybe are starting to go off the rails before they even statistically start to go off of the rails. So things like if the data has changed a little bit, the features have changed a little bit on the engineering. Is it still within the realm of expected outcomes? How frequently are we seeing some of these outcomes, particularly those that might be a little bit more anomalous? Fourth thing, very critical, is understanding, and again, it kind of goes hand in hand with the previous one, but specifically around ethics and bias and how we are going to understand if we're moving in the right direction on those topics. Those are special metrics in and of themselves. Bias can come from both data and models. Can come from outputs that came from models and are ingested as data. And it can get very complex, right? Whenever you're dealing with machine learning or other forms of AI. We've seen as much as, often 80% of the time, the bias is coming from the data itself. And in many cases, the historical data. Someone's completed a wonderful digitization project. Well, guess what happened with that data that was now digitized? If that data is 50 years old, along with it is all of the sentiment and all of the possible bias that was encapsulated 50 years ago. We're now using that to train our models. That's probably a problem, right? Or something at the very least that you should keep an eye on. And being able to debias, it's a continuous process, right? So being able to, again, have a little piece call out there from the dashboard we looked at a couple of minutes ago, being able to track some key metrics, may or may not be gender for your model, but whatever those key features are, being able to understand, are they heading in the right direction, specifically around systemic bias. And so one of the things that we recommend, first and foremost, it's continuous. So it's not like you had a good first run with your model and it goes off into the wild, and now we believe that it is working ethically and without bias. That's simply not true. Lots of different triggers for this. It could be new data, it could be a host of things, but it's an ongoing curation process. And we highly recommend that you take the time at the beginning when you're bringing your humans into the loop to build out, hopefully, some of your tracking and your monitoring before you start to lay down those algorithms. You take the time and you think about the internal analytics that you want to use as a bellwether to really start to track if before things go off the rails, before things go out into the wild. And then you need to do that on an ongoing basis. And it doesn't have to be really involved. Often the simplest measurements are the best for being able to start to get a bellwether on bias. So for example, we had a client a few months ago where we were doing some work with them. They wanted to be able to use AI to do some automation of being able to do loan approvals and do it in a way that was very unbiased and equal. And we took their training data in, and our algorithms started producing biased results. This was before it went out into the wild. And we noticed this and we called their attention to it. And when we looked against the existing data that they had and the existing results, our algorithms were working correctly. The sad truth was there was already inherent bias baked into their previous outcomes and previous processes in their organization. So like it or not, before we could create algorithms that would perform better. They had to go back and do some homework on their side and say, okay, how are we going to measure this and move the needle in our organization? And now what we need to do is automate the system in a way that it performs the way we want it to perform, not merely automating the jobs that the humans had already been doing. And we learned that from just a very simple metric, in this case of tracking by gender, and looking at how many men and how many women were approved for small business loans at this particular institution. And we did this working closely with SMEs who had a good gut check of what they expected to be happening. Hopefully that it would be very equal. So ongoing curation, an ongoing need there for humans in the loop. And then finally, thinking back to the top of our pyramid that we looked at a few minutes ago, there's the actual use of the system itself. And typically the system use and the humans in the loop there are not data scientists. They are sometimes these SME users of the system, or they are other individuals who are consumers of information that come out of the system. And this is a huge opportunity to be able to teach our models to perform better. And at the same time, where the human and technology handshake comes in, it's an opportunity also as those systems improve to help our humans maybe notice things that they wouldn't have had a chance to even think about before because they don't have the scale and the capacity to do it. So now our models can ingest and take into account situations that the humans maybe never even could have had an opportunity to consider in the past. So it's very much this kind of co-learning experience, right? So let me show you a couple of examples of how the human in the loop of a system in use then can drive the model. So imagine that you're looking at a couple of different experiences here where we have an expert end user in one case and a consumer end user in another case. Both computer visioning examples. On the top left here, what we have is we've automated identification of aircraft. So this might be a system, let's say, that could be used for planning and logistics. It could be a system that is used for security at an airport. And we're using computer visioning to identify the aircraft and make sure that we have aircraft in the right places at the right times and there are no rogue behaviors happening. Well, in this case, the human has noticed that maybe an aircraft was not properly identified, or maybe the system identified most of them but failed to identify this particular one for whatever reason. So the human is in the loop, and it's giving the human is giving their suggestion back to the system. And so every time we do that and we instruct the model based on that SME knowledge, right, the model is learning and improving. And the same thing on the bottom right in a more B2C sort of way. This is some computer visioning where maybe the facial recognition hasn't, quite identified the right individual. So now the human is being brought in to do that. And so our model is learning. In both cases, each time the model is getting smarter and the human is able to give that feedback to the system. So I don't have an example of it here, but you could imagine as things are more sophisticated now, when you're talking about AI, perhaps suggesting a financial transaction. I'm a hedge fund manager. I'm using it, in a more mission critical capacity for something. That this co-learning is a tremendous opportunity that we're missing out on if we don't take advantage of it by leveraging the both implicit and explicit actions that humans are taking in the experiences that they're having. So an implicit action might be that a human just naturally acts on a recommendation, right? So a simple B2C example of this is, whenever let's say you're driving in your car and you go left instead of right, and you choose to over and over again take a different path from, let's say, the recommended direction. That's implicit. The user is going to take an action. They're not necessarily overtly going down any particular, complicated workflow or something. Or it could be something more, explicit, like the examples I just shared, where now I'm overtly going in and I'm reassigning that aircraft. And in some cases where things are more complicated, sometimes when we gather that information from users, we go so far as to ask them why they're modifying a recommendation in some way, or in this case, maybe why they're modifying that aircraft that was assigned, so our models can get smarter. Overall, whenever we bring humans into the loop, we not only increase accuracy using our end users, we also increase trust. Now the user is playing a vital role in the ownership of the system. On average, what we've seen when we bring humans into the loop across the board, some of the tips that I was mentioning and capped with the human in the loop on the front end, offering that SME expert tease back to the model, we see a lift of at least 5% typically, sometimes more. And then finally, bringing humans into the loop costs less overall, right? So as a business, we're typically trying to figure out, the best balance, right? How much do I spend to save? How much do I exert in my investment in AI so that I don't lose money? And this is an example that has to do with fraud. I don't lose too much money on investigation or too much money in fraud. Bringing in a human into the loop helps to balance that equation. So sometimes it's not just about improving accuracy or increasing trust. We can also balance the equation to ensure that we're spending the right amount of effort of human capital as well as literal capital, on what we're doing. So that concludes our discussion on how to improve your accuracy and trust in your AI by bringing humans into the loop. Thank you very much.